really have anything. No.
You like my passing attempt at a Sherlock Holmes hat?
You need the pipe now too.
Oh man, I have a pipe somewhere. It'd be like a corncob pipe though. Oh well.
I mean, honestly, it's just like the hat. It's close enough. And isn't that what we go for in this show?
That's isn't my life in a nutshell? Yes, absolutely.
Isn't that the Voyage podcast in a nutshell? Is close enough.
I think that's their
you talk to our
statement.
intrepid producer. Oh no! Actually, take that out, Jacob. We got to rephrase that.
Yeah.
Oh wait, I said the Voyage podcast.
Don't give production credit to people who don't deserve it.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Hey, you know what I forgot to include in my Who Is Your Favorite Sherlock is Will Ferrell. Everyone's favorite Sherlock.
How could you forget Will Ferrell, man?
You know who else
absolutely magisterially owned that role, you know?
And you know what? In terms of formative Sherlock Holmes, like childhood formative Sherlock, it's probably The Great Mouse Detective, the animated Disney movie, The Great Mouse Detective.
Rewatched that movie with my kids, at least my young kids. Like, I don't know, it's probably like a month or two ago. So
it holds up.
Fitting.
That one, I've seen that one so many times.
Dude, that's
too.
got Vincent Price as what's that evil rat's name?
Radigan.
Radigan. How could I forget Radigan?
You know what's funny is you put Basil Rathbone, and that's what reminded me of it is Radigan, which made me go Great Mouse Detective, of course.
Well, you know, that's Basil Rathbone. He is Sherlock Holmes. All right, so like.
Well, in the audience, if you haven't deduced this already, if you haven't deduced this is a Sherlock Holmes episode.
Included out. Yep.
Yeah. The game is afoot, and we are doing a Sherlock Holmes episode. Which there's nothing like in the moment Sherlock, but Sherlock Holmes is just such a perennial figure that there's always some Sherlock Holmes property, and there's so many for us to choose from. I mean, Jacob and I have had so many off, camera conversations that we figured we might as well just make an episode out of it.
Or maybe we just need to pad out our summer season with random episodes. And so,
okay, why would you do that? Why would you totally undermine
reveal the mystery?
Why would you just pull back the curtain? Why don't you? We haven't even done a Wizard of Oz episode, and here you are pulling back the curtain.
I'm nothing if not honest.
You're a dunce like Watson. That's why.
I just like to undermine you on every turn, even if it's undermining myself. I will sacrifice my own credibility if it means that I can, tear you down just a little bit more.
You know what we call that in the spiritual life, Jacob? We call that
over
envy.
Reichenbach Falls together, Mike. That's what's happening here. We're going down together. Yeah. Yes.
See, and I finally understand that reference after so many tries of watching.
How many times
the Robert Downey Jr.
How could you find such a popcorn entertaining movie like those two films that hard to get? I don't get it. I mean, it's Robert Downey Jr. He's like the most charismatic actor like working today. What's going on?
It's not about the movie, not about the actors or whatever. It's just, I don't know.
You found it droll, didn't you?
No,
it was droll. That's what it was. Gauche. Robert Downey, he's actually, in some sense, his character might be the most Conan Doyle accurate, honestly. Obviously,
how so?
Guy Ritchie takes a lot of liberties with the execution, the editing, and the way those movies are put together. But Sherlock Holmes in the stories. All right, so I was cruelly interrupted earlier when I was about to tell everyone about Basil Rathbone, right? So let me go back to Basil Rathbone, and then I'll explain why Robert Downey Jr. is actually more accurate. Basil Rathbone, he is the deer hunter cap, pipe in his mouth. Elementary, my dear Watson. like that whole persona is 100% the Basil Rathbone Sherlock movies, and he did it for decades, right? So the reason why people think of Sherlock Holmes and they have that mental image of him, it comes from decades of Basil Rathbone playing. All right.
Okay.
Now that being said, and that was my introduction to Sherlock Holmes, and that was my mental image of him forever too, right? But then in adulthood, if you start to actually read the Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes novels, he's not like Basil Rathbone. Like, he kind of is, right? There's absolutely DNA there, but Basil Rathbone takes, I guess, kind of like the clean cut elements, or at least the Victorian gentleman elements of what was present in Conan Doyle, and because it's like Hollywood from like the 50s and 40s, and so it's got to be like cleaned up for audiences. They remove all of the kind of like unsavory elements of Sherlock Holmes, and so if the character in the stories is a drug addict, like so in fact the BBC Sherlock,
they do nod to that.
They do, right? So like the Robert Downey Sherlock and the BBC Sherlock, some combination of those two characterizations is kind of what I think Sherlock Holmes reads like in the actual stories, because Robert Downey takes him like kind of too crazy.
He's kind of like he's almost like a pirate version, like Robert Downey's version,
Yeah. Well, at the same time though, and they both do this, both the BBC one and Downey, he is fairly sociopathic, right? Like, he really doesn't care about people's opinions all that much. That being said, he is still a Victorian gentleman. And so while he's unafraid to be a weirdo, and he's he doesn't care about what other people think about him in that regard, he still is a product of his time, right? And so I would say that Benedict Cumberbatch still looks like a 21st century British citizen, right?
And I mean, the show that's the point of the show too, is that everything is updated. They're not trying to make it 1800s.
Well, that being said, though, no, but his
time period,
like the soul of the character is reasonably approximate to like how he is in the stories. But then also so is Robert Downey's version of the character.
But Robert Downey's is not meant to be updated, because Robert Downey's is late 1800s, like in those stories, whereas the Benedict Cumberbatch, and that's the only time I'm saying the name right the whole episode.
Yeah, you're quite good at all the different permutations of how you can spell out or say. It's a gift,
it's an exercise. Mike. It's an exercise in creativity.
It's a grace. It's a grace that you appreciate.
Brundy Batch Crumbly Bun, his version is meant to be in our time period. Like it's modern day England.
So
like that's
the
also the difference.
Oh, I get it now. I get it.
Okay,
it all makes sense, Mike. Thanks for pointing that out to me. I was really confused for a really long time, because I was like, where are all the horses and buggies? I don't get it. So what's happening here?
You know what, Jacob? Sometimes, and this is, I guess, you pulling back the veil a little bit. Sometimes these conversations, we've already had these, and we know that each other knows, but it might be for somebody who hasn't seen the BBC Sherlock or hasn't seen the Robert Downey one. Because they don't ingest media at the same rate as.
You don't think they would deduce, huh? You don't think they would? I'm just kidding. Actually, I suppose you're right. I suppose there's some people don't know that Benedict Cumberbatch went and got his start in Sherlock. I don't know if it was his start.
Did he get his start? I thought he was already a thing, but I mean,
I don't know.
When is he's been in some it's hard to keep track of when the big movies he's been in, obviously, because this is before Doctor Strange, but he was in when was The Imitation Game? That was a big one.
I know, and it might have been around the same time. You know what's the most unrealistic thing about the BBC Sherlock Holmes is that he's not just Googling everything. Because what this has reminded me,
fast enough.
We don't.
It's not fast enough.
He's quicker than Google. See, no one has to detect anything anymore. If we want to know when Sherlock Holmes, Benedict Cumberbatch came out, we just Google it, right? Well, the internet has taken away our sleuthing.
At least when the first one, they were still using Blackberries. I thought it wasn't necessarily it wasn't on smartphones.
It was early,
so
which is why I think
necessarily, because Blackberries, it wouldn't come as obvious to just Google it as it would on a smartphone. But Anyway, moving on. As scintillating as this conversation is, let's actually get into. Get into
We can't move on from all the different versions of Sherlock Holmes without mentioning Shia LaBeouf. He played young Sherlock. He's in a movie from the 80s in which he plays a young. It's like, back in the day, and he's like a teenage Sherlock Holmes.
There's no way it's from the 80s.
It might be the 90s, but I'm gonna guess. It's like 89. That's my guess. Man, I don't know.
That's what I'm going to use to find out the answer.
How come you have not, picked up on, whatever, some breadcrumb trail of minor details to figure out when that movie came out? Because Google has dulled your senses, sir.
I'm kind of shocked by this. I don't know. I've never heard of this.
Never heard?
No.
This is like one of his early roles.
It must be, yeah. I don't know.
Well,
so this is pre-Even Stevens. This is pre-Even Stevens?
I think it's 89. So the suspense is killing me.
I don't like this. You gotta cut this out, Jacob. This is so okay. So
I'm getting over a cough, by the way. So if any of that comes
I can't find like.
Wow,
okay, I'm
at Shia LaBeouf's.
I'm at Shia LaBeouf's IMDb page.
Young Sherlock Holmes.
There is a young Sherlock Holmes movie. But that's not...
Came out in 1985.
That's not the Shia LaBeouf.
That is Shia LaBeouf. He's just so young it doesn't look like him.
No,
that's not him.
No, it's not. I've seen young Sherlock Holmes, but that's not Shia LaBeouf.
Oh, what am I doing? Wow.
Yeah, this is getting cut. It's just like...
Okay. Well, I don't know. I haven't seen this movie in 2 decades, so... For some reason,
I do remember watching this as a kid.
Yeah.
And I thought there was some other young Sherlock Holmes that Shia LaBeouf was in. But Shia LaBeouf, like, he's
a little past this era, isn't he?
He was born in 1986. So he definitely wasn't in that movie.
It's a very young Sherlock Holmes. It's just a toddler. It's like the Muppet Baby version of Sherlock Holmes.
He wasn't even a glimmer in his father's eye.
What? What would a Muppet Baby version of Sherlock Holmes be? Like a toddler?
I feel like the new version. I feel like there is because they did reboot Muppet Babies. This is all getting cut, by the way. They did reboot Muppet Babies, and I feel like Kermit is like a Sherlock Holmes. I'm gonna search that quick.
We don't even have time to just cut all this out, Mike. You're on a deadline.
So, Sherlock Holmes is a Muppet in the Muppet Show. Okay.
Well, let's get back.
Gosh,
let's
please.
Get back to the conversation.
Hey. Shia LaBeouf. You don't want that included in the episode. Well, I'd rather have a 40-minute episode than include that. All right.
Okay. You know what's interesting about
him? Well, yeah, go ahead.
What's interesting about Sherlock Holmes, this is the other thing that I realized from the story. So I did like...
Stop. Okay, now say it.
You're really convinced that I'm actually going to edit all this stuff out, aren't you?
Oh my gosh, please.
So anyway, one of the things that I also picked up on is that, Sherlock Holmes is like no kidding, the first superhero. And I mean that explicitly. That's not me just like making a statement. Obviously, it didn't really have a definition for superhero, though maybe the Nietzschean Übermensch is kind of like in the zeitgeist around this time. And he is that, though, and it's explicit. So the first novel is A Study in Scarlet, and that's when Watson meets Holmes, and that's when he's explained as a character and all the initial introductions to who he is as a person. And in that story, he's basically like, I only care about fighting criminals, and so I've dedicated my entire life to fighting criminals. And so he's Batman. Like he spends all of his, he knows nothing, right? Like hilariously, Holmes has to inform him about the Copernican revolution because Watson has to inform Holmes about the Copernican revolution because he has no idea that the Earth revolves around the sun. All right. Like this is who Conan Doyle's Holmes is, right? Which is why later versions of him have taken him. I mean, they're still very faithful to some degree, but it's also very very different, right? Because the Holmes of Conan Doyle is a super eccentric person who cares about nothing other than just perfecting and honing his craft, including just basic knowledge of things. And so really the only things he knows are like what it takes to like crack a case. And that's the only thing that he pays attention to. It's a kind of like,
how does heliocentrism not play into cracking cases? That's what's,
actually. And so because I knew we were doing this, I've been rewatching the BBC Sherlocks, right? And they actually make a reference to this in like season 2, like the first episode of season 2. And it's done really funny in that show. Because again, I have the same response reading the book that viewers of the BBC show are going to have. And it's like, how are you not aware of that? How are you not aware of that? And what Benedict Cumberbatch does in his response to it is hilarious. And like, who cares about what the sun does, or what we do to the sun, but in the books, in the BBC series, it's kind of like very strange. In the books, that's actually just who the character is. He is just super zoned into only fighting criminals and only cracking cases. So instead of having like a regular education, he just knows how to like box and sword fight. And, he like exercises and it's like
and play the violin.
That's he's got the violin too.
And then what does that have to do with solving crimes? But, I guess he needs a break.
It's like how he like evens himself out, I guess. Even Sherlock Holmes understands that he has to have some way to decompress, I guess. But then, if he's not cracking cases, he's sitting there doing cocaine and playing violin. He's a weird character in the Conan Doyle.
Which they kind of they psychoanalyze a little bit in the BBC version too, because it obviously, I mean, you're supposed to maybe infer that it has to do with like it's almost like his body needs to catch up with his brain, sort of like his brain moves so fast, and so he needs a stimulant. Which ironically, right, the stimulant is affecting the brain and all that stuff. But it's sort of like that's kind of the I don't know. It's almost like you could almost say it's like an allegory for like what he's already doing. Like his brain is acting like a person on cocaine, sort of.
Kind of, yeah. One of the things that I do think that the Robert Downey and the Benedict Cumberbatch version do well is paint him as an eccentric, right? Because in the stories, that's also, he's really like he's kind of a celebrity in the stories as well. And so I guess most people, it seems to be the case that, and I haven't read all of them. There's tons of them. There's just dozens of these stories. So I've read the novels. I've read, because I think there's 4 novels. I've read 3 of them, and I've read a handful of short stories. He's kind of a freak, right? Not to be rude about it or something like that, but like he is a weirdo, right? Mm-hmm. But he's also a posh weirdo who still has Victorian sensibilities and all that stuff, right? So it's not like he's some kind of like punk rocker, that he's still like a gentleman. Well, but he's a very strange gentleman.
And I mean, you see this in probably a lot of iterations, like, because Watson is supposed to represent, even though Watson in his own right, it's like he's ex-military, so he's got that like, we see him a lot in terms of he has to like defend Holmes, whether it's his ability to shoot or to fight. But then he also is a doctor, so then he has that kind of medical expertise. So like he's no slouch when it comes to intelligence, but he's also supposed to represent the sort of like the viewer or the everyman, where it's like he's a normal, well-adjusted person.
Well, actually, I do think that it's kind of inexplicable why Holmes keeps Watson around in some of these other like super versions of Sherlock Holmes, because basically he's become like the BBC version and the Downey version. He's crazy superhuman, right? And he's still really, really impressive in the Conan Doyle stories, and arguably like contrived to be kind of superhuman even by our standards still. But like BBC Sherlock, he's like a human computer. He's like a mentat out of Doom. Like he's able, it's beyond the pale, more or less. Whereas in the Conan Doyle stories, again, he's not a doctor, right? See, I think that like whenever you get examples of BBC Sherlock, needing some kind of like other person's opinion, it's always just condescension, right? because he already kind of knows everything. He's just 100% encyclopedic, which is also why it kind of doesn't make sense that he doesn't understand that the Earth revolves around the sun in the BBC show. But in the short stories, in the Conan Doyle stories, no, he has a very specific knowledge set. And so he has his doctor friend who actually is able to contribute like useful information because he's not a doctor. He's just a super crime fighter, right? So like it's kind of interesting to compare how he's transformed across pop culture into what he is now. What he was then.
And speaking of because what you're kind of describing too is like, even though in some cases he's described as, like you said, almost a supercomputer or this like superhuman intelligence, not just, very high level human intelligence. And so there are these sort of blind spots. And it kind of brings us to, these are, of course, mystery novels, mystery stories, mystery short stories. And so we wanted this episode to not just be, us talking about, well, here's what he does in this show, here's what he does in this show, but an exploration into mystery itself. And so that's, what's like, let's talk a little bit into, obviously it can be where Holmes is the iterations of Holmes and his blind spots are, what the sort of Christian revelation has to say about this concept of mystery and how it either conforms, but also how it diverges from our kind of modern understanding of the word mystery.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is obviously up my alley, right? Because I'm all Eastern Christian. So we like mystery. It's everything.
I mean, I'm not going to let you like hijack the term and take it for yourself, but sure.
We still call our sacraments mysteries.
If that's what you need, Watson, then that's fine. Yeah.
I'm the one wearing the hat, man. Yeah. I mean, like if anyone's.
And you're by far more of the Holmes of this duo anyway. But moving on.
I'm certainly an eccentric, weirdo. So I guess maybe that works, right? If anyone's going to be a doctor, it's going to be you. But one of the things that I think is also lost in translation across time, especially for modern audiences. They did this with Velma too in Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
I'm going to rant about Velma here.
Well, the new HBO series, just to be clear, because I mean, obviously we've seen Velma and a tons of like the group of the Mystery Machine or the all of them. Actually, there was the new series on HBO.
I have not sullied myself with the new HBO Max series.
Oh, I thought that's what you were referring to.
No, I refuse to watch that show.
So this is in
I've heard about it. No, this isn't children's entertainment. These are the cartoons that I watch with my 8-year-olds and below. Velma nowadays is basically kind of like a new age ripoff.
Uh-huh.
She's not straight out like there's no line that I've watched a ton of Scooby-Doo. I grew up watching Scooby-Doo. Scooby-Doo is one of my personal childhood favorites, and all of my kids have liked Scooby-Doo. So I have seen just dozens and dozens and dozens of hours of Scooby-Doo movie content. I'm pretty much caught up on like most Scooby-Doo.
I feel like how the old TV show had like crossovers with like Scooby-Doo and Batman or Scooby-Doo and this. Wasn't there like Scooby-Doo a Scooby-Doo and Sherlock Holmes? I feel like that for some reason the image is just like appearing in my head, but I could just be conflating a bunch of stuff.
Wow. Well, you're probably gonna like immediately call me. This is you tearing me down now, huh? Like it's like, wow.
No, sorry.
Does he?
I could just be totally making it up. So
the problem is that there's just hundreds of hours of Scooby-Doo.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to. That definitely seems like it should have happened.
No. So
am I making that up in my mind, or did that actually exist? I don't know.
So the episode is called "Elementary, My Dear Shaggy," and the Mystery Inc. gang teams up with the legendary literary detective Sherlock Holmes, who may or may not just be a delusional impersonator to solve the case of the Screaming Skulls of London.
It's one of the newer iterations. It's got to be. What era
2019.
Is that from?
Yep, 2019.
Yep. There's a new Scooby-Doo show. It's Scooby-Doo and Guess Who, I think is what it's called, which is actually really good. It's the closest version to like the original 70s Scooby-Doo's. And they do that thing where they have a guest star every episode. And so that's where I'm guessing it's out of that version of Scooby-Doo. But anyway, nowadays Velma, in the last couple movies that I've seen, she's like a skeptic. She's like a rational materialist skeptic, right? And I get it. Scooby-Doo has always been a show about like, it's not actually a supernatural problem. It's just a dude in a mask. But the kids in the 70s, all the way up until like the 2010s, there was never some kind of metaphysical statement in any of this content. It was always like, they were sleuths. They were like Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, just like following some clues, but they didn't have an opinion. Most of the time, they were actually scared of the monsters, implying that they actually thought the monsters could be real, right? But nowadays,
Shaggy and Scooby always kind of represented that.
Even the other kids too. Yeah, definitely Shaggy and Scooby for sure. And hey, I'm not saying that Velma is not always been like the smartest one in the room.
They're the naive simpletons.
Yeah. So. They nowadays the juxtaposition is that Velma is like, I don't believe in fairy tales. I don't believe in, she makes statements like that.
Which is very anti Conan Doyle, who did believe in fairies.
She did. She did. We're gonna get So anyway,
it betrays. Yeah.
Modern Sherlock is kind of like this too, though, right? Like, BBC Sherlock is clearly not a believer. I don't know. I think that to some extent Robert Downey's probably like that too. Though I'm trying to remember if there's really explicit example.
I mean, I can't really remember. Yeah. Doesn't really seem to go there. But they do kind of deal with some like occult stuff. So I could see, it seems like it would stand out if he like rolls his eyes. Yeah, at the first one. You're like, oh, it's just these foolish, naive.
Yeah, there's actually whatever. BBC Sherlock explicitly is like, there is no heaven. Like, one of the jokes in the show is he like tells that to some kids when they're like, is mommy in heaven now? And he's like, no, it's just a story they tell you or something like that.
Yeah.
He's real dismissive of it. Which, whatever. Yeah, par for the course, right? However, that being said, I do not believe Conan Doyle's Sherlock would have been like that. For one, Conan Doyle himself was a spiritualist, right? Like what you were saying. He 100% believed in things beyond the realm of like material reality, right? He's really open to it. And the Conan Doyle
lot of Sherlock stories, a lot of the short stories and novel, they deal with like, and sometimes it is sort of debunked Scooby-Doo style, where it's just a guy wearing a mask, right?
Sure.
Or the equivalent of a guy wearing a mask. But a lot of them do dwell in this kind of area of sort of the occult, sort of the hidden kind of esoteric world of, underground London or whatever. But sorry,
they are very Scooby-Doo like that. Yeah, there is a lot of these mystery type, this genre. It's a really nice pairing with like the occult, right? It just works. It's like peanut butter and jelly or chocolate and peanut butter. Peanut butter just goes with everything.
You just sound really into peanut butter, but
I'm just a real peanut butter kind of guy.
Peanut butter and anything. Okay, Elvis, keep going. As you were.
Peanut butter and celery. The occult really plays well with this genre, right? It is, there's always a rational explanation in the Conan Doyle stories. I'm not aware of any that actually have a supernatural explanation. There are moments where Sherlock Holmes is like, I don't know anything about the spirit world, that's not for me to say. Like, he's just super agnostic about it. Frankly, he doesn't really care about
it. That's the fair approach. And that's what sort of betrays it when he does the whole there's no heaven. Like a real Sherlock would be like, I don't know if there's a heaven. And I can't tell you anything.
You know what his superpower is, right? Now, he spent his whole life training himself Batman style to be like the peak human crime solver guy. But his natural, and they actually discussed this in a story where his brother Mycroft is introduced, right? Who is super different in the story than he is in the BBC series. The BBC series does something very different. Whereas the Downey Jr. movies, that's actually way more similar, I would say, to Mycroft in the stories. Because in the stories, Mycroft is like a better version of Sherlock Holmes than Sherlock Holmes is. And Sherlock Holmes admits this. But the problem is whereas Sherlock Holmes actually took his abilities of deduction, and really he has the energy and the will and the desire to use it and to perfect it and to hone it. Mycroft is an example of someone who has that natural grace, who has the natural innate talent for it, even exceeding Sherlock Holmes, but he's lazy. He's lazy and he doesn't care, and he's not interested in crime solving. In fact, he's kind of a social recluse because he actually can't turn it off like ever. Like, there is no violin or cocaine for Mycroft. And he basically just like sits in a reclusive gentleman's club and just like, leave me alone. No one talk to me. Like, I don't want to do anything with him. He's just like, just reclines all day.
I'll accidentally solve a crime. I'll accidentally,
Yeah.
you know, like, no,
Yeah, no,
don't give me any
absolutely.
details. Or
Well, and, you know, so the thing, what Sherlock Holmes and Mycroft's superhero power is that they actually are able to enter into this absolute state of openness, where one of the common refrains that Sherlock Holmes says all the time is that you see, but you do not observe, right? You have all this like data around you, and so your eyeballs are working, you know, like lights entering your eyes, and you're seeing things, but you're not actually paying attention to any of it. And what
you don't
they're
have
able to
eyes
do,
to see.
they don't have eyes to see. No, that's exactly right. You know, if you use the camera lens analogy, like you can have like a focus point, like a focal point that's either broad, open, or really, you know, small, right, minute. And that's going to affect how much of the world is brought into your gaze through the lens. And all
the visual mediums of this does it really well, because there's always a point where he starts describing something and then it zooms in on the person's fingertip and it's like, oh, you have some dirt under your finger that nobody else would notice, but he sees it as it's obviously this thing, which means you were here doing this thing, you know?
Right. Well, he's able.
So it's like we get the literal camera, you know, lens focus thing happening. We
get to follow the specific trail, whereas he's got like a whole world of trails going on all the time, or at least in the Conan Doyle stories, he has that going on when he turns it on, right? Whereas Mycroft, it's on just like all the time. Whereas what Sherlock does is he uses it when he needs it, kind of thing. And so so he's just always bringing everything in, and he's rejecting nothing, right? This goes back to what we were talking about, where he's ultimately just the most agnostic, open-minded individual ever. And that's how he's allowed and able to solve these crimes, because he doesn't follow he doesn't ignore this bit of detail because he's fixated on this quote unquote logical detail that he thinks he should be following. And because he keeps his mind open to everything, he's able to actually find the right trail quicker than most people are.
And that's goes back to your supercomputer thing. It's like he's seen all of the different avenues, but then he's also done the higher level thinking skill of evaluating and, you know, saying which one is the actual like best, most logical scenario or the most likely scenario, right? So you've eliminated the impossible, and then even this improbable one must be the, you know, the true path to follow.
Did you ever want to actually try to like practice it? I don't. I'm too lazy. I'm a Mycroft more than a Holmes or Sherlock. But, you know, because when you read the books, or maybe if you're watching the shows or whatever, it's basically like, you know, he's got dirt under his nails. What does that mean? It's like, well, I guess it means he must have been playing in the dirt. And ultimately, that's all it is like whenever Sherlock actually goes on and spools this stuff, you know, sometimes it gets like too crazy. Like the modern versions of Sherlock, where he really is just like the supercomputer guy,
where that he gets like somehow too crazy. Knows the entire contrived bus schedule of the city of London or something like that.
Or
it's
like, what airplane has the right seating arrangement for this? You know, like this kind of like crazy. Like
it's like he's sitting,
stuff?
You know, reading blueprints of whatever. I mean, that's
Whereas like, you know, the Conan Doyle Sherlock, he's more like it's just common sense. He's like, I mean, honestly, all you have to do is just see the stuff and then realize that has to imply that he was playing in the dirt somehow. You know, what else does dirt under sense,
it made me think of the BBC Grumbly Bun Cumberly. I don't know. That's a bad one too.
Well,
it made me think of the when he's like, man, what must it be like for you? It must be so boring. Like,
that is like, honestly, that is hilariously, You know, Benedict Cumberbatch does do a hilarious job. It's a very humorous, you know, persona, or whatever. But yeah, to bring it back into who Sherlock Holmes as a character is, we've lost something about what makes him actually cool in the Conan Doyle stories because of his open-mindedness, because of his absolute agnosticism. And I'm not saying you should be an agnostic in the Christian, like, theological sense, but I'm saying that a lot of what's wrong with our kind of reduced, disenchanted lives that we experience nowadays, even in our Christian religion, right? The fact that we we don't remember Christ at all times, and we don't think that we live in a world full of angels and saints, and like that's never really like laying on our hearts, is because we're just so materialist and we're so narrow minded, right? Like we're not really constantly aware. Our focus isn't big enough.
And ironically, because like you said, this even takes place within the church, is you have this kind of reductionist mindset even when it comes to the faith itself. So it's like, okay, we'll allow for, God, or we'll allow for Jesus or the resurrection or even sacraments, but we still are just reducing it to either this, like just this list of things. And go back to like you almost said, and I thought you were going to say, like, even within Christianity, there is room for a lot of agnosticism. Like basically anything that is not, infallibly defined dogma, there we can be to some degree agnostic on. And just as a, one example that always comes up in the classroom is I'll get students ask me like, do I believe in aliens, or do I believe that, or can we believe in aliens and stuff like that? And I realize that there are implications on saying yes or no, but the beauty is that we are allowed to be agnostic on that, right? And we can think through, we can deduce the consequences of a yes answer or a no answer. But the fact is that, for one, it's not a mystery of the faith, or it's not a dogma of the faith whether aliens exist. And so we're allowed a lot of freedom there. And it reminds me of one last thing. G.K. Chesterton has this analogy that he uses when it comes to the existence of dogma within Christianity. And obviously him being a Catholic convert, he's very supportive of it. He says that dogma exists in the same way that a fence exists around a playground.
Oh, sure.
Is that it allows the kids actually a lot more freedom to extend to the borders of the playground. Whereas if you don't have a fence there, then they don't actually use up all of the space of the playground, right? Because they don't know where the line is. And so they sort of create their own boundaries of what's safe because they don't know, how far they can actually go.
Those boundaries are less than they need to be.
Yeah.
Right?
And so it actually limits your faith. It reduces your faith to sort of a human imposed limit, which, the whole point of Christianity is that it's not a man-made, a human-made religion. It's that God has revealed it, and God is infinite. And so there should be a very, a very expansive way to look at it.
Well,
this is where, for all of our quote unquote mysteries of faith, right? You were saying before how, the word in the Eastern Church for sacrament, in the Western Church, we use the word sacrament, but
Latin,
you use the word,
just Latin.
Sacramentum, but the word sacramentum in Greek is mysterion. And so they're talking about the same reality. It's just, what word is emphasizing.
Yeah, where we get the word mystery from. Because mystery, within the sacramental context, mystery doesn't mean a case to solve. It means something that is beyond normal comprehension. Right?
Doesn't mean it was the groundskeeper the whole time.
No.
Now, it does mean...
The mask does not
Jacob,
fall off.
Ready for this? It does mean it was the gardener the whole time. If you think of the resurrection story. You like that?
Nice. I like that. No, so to get back to what you're saying about like the openness of Christianity, like the bigness of Christianity, right? Kind of a Lewisian way to talk about it. Is like, I don't think Jesus could have loved the people he loved in the Gospels without it being a clue to the openness of Christianity. In other words, the people who would reject, like the Good Samaritan example, parables that he would tell, or just talking to women at the well, or talking to, prostitutes and things like that. These are all things that polite people just didn't do, right? They were hedged in by their dedication to serving God in a pure way, okay? They're coming from a place of piety. They are, just fundamentally so. It's just that Jesus comes along and says, listen, I'm all about piety, purity, holiness. Yeah. Clearly keep doing that. But that is not... Love requires you to be able to like look past the ugliness and the sin and see like the value there. In other words, you have to be open to the worth of the human underneath all the sin, right? And you have to be able to like kind of like turn off your, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about that? And be able to just like be broad enough, have a big enough heart, be able to perceive what's actually there, right? So to use the Sherlock stuff as an analogy, right? He's able to see the truth of the matter because he's not fixated on details that are irrelevant, what he needs to be seen, right? It's a perfect analogy for how we're supposed to engage with the world around us and the cultures around us and things like that. And I'm not, let me just say this because I'm not a syncretist and I don't like an awful lot of what's going on in the world these days. I am curmudgeonly, all right? I am cynical and defeated and angry about the state of affairs in life.
It's true. It's true. Yes. For those who, for those of us who get to talk with them outside of this,
outside of this happy-go-lucky persona. I'm an angry man inside.
No, you're a real joy, Jacob. we love to have you around.
But this is true. This is true, and it's something that I always have to be reminded of and try to remind myself of, is that like Jesus is bigger than like the details of sin or the details of cultural erosion. So, Sherlock Holmes teaches us that.
Well, and and one of the beautiful thing about this part of this conversation too. So I wanted to step back to one thing you said, because you're talking about how there can sometimes be this temptation within Christianity to like uphold one virtue at the expense of the others, even a virtue that on the outside it looks really great. Like you said, piety. Piety is a great virtue, but it is not the virtue. And one of the things that we see in Aquinas's Summa Theologiae is he asks the question, what is the form of the virtues? What is the virtue that forms all the others? And if whatever one you can determine is, then all the other virtues, they may even have to be sacrificed for that form. And he determines it to be charity, which you even said. You said love, but love, charity, that's the form of the virtues. And so even a virtue like piety may have to be sacrificed for the sake of charity. And it's a hard thing, right? It's easy to make a choice between a bad thing and a good thing, or a wrong thing and a right thing. But it's harder to make a choice between a lesser right thing and a greater right thing. And sometimes it's even determining, and prudence helps us with this, it helps us determine, is piety, the most important virtue in this moment, or does it need to be sacrificed for even, like I said, the virtue of charity or hospitality or, temperance or whatever, or justice?
Well, and, some of this stuff has come out in, recent episodes of Lord of Spirits podcast where they're going into the Torah and they're defining the cleanliness codes and the moral codes or whatever. And a lot of the themes of those episodes was the fact that Jesus was coming around saying that people were being too pious in one direction towards cleanliness, towards ritual cleanliness, right? Don't touch a dead body. And at the same time, like the Torah also demands that you bury a dead body, or that you help someone or take care of, all this stuff that would actually make you ritually unclean to do so. But it's actually more important for you to love the neighbor or take care of the moral law at the expense of your ritual cleanliness, at the expense of your piety, right? And so this conversation just kind of reminds me of that.
Well, one of the other balancing acts that I think Sherlock sort of illustrates for us. So we were already talking about the sense of mystery, right? And how, the original Conan Doyle Sherlock was much more open to, or much more agnostic. And I would say we use that in the best sense of the term. Like sometimes agnostic can mean I don't know, which I would say is the right way of using it. But then it can also mean one can't know, which, like you said before, that's actually more of a radical skepticism, which sometimes, like I said, it is confused for agnosticism, but it's not actually the same thing. And that's where we see kind of the almost the corruption of the Sherlock Holmes or Sherlock Holmes-like characters, is this, agnosticism becoming a radical skepticism. But what's one of the great things about within the Christian tradition is we have the sense of mystery, right? Sure. So we have the really, really big, expansive playground, but we can also know some things for sure from this common sense. And you even said, like, one of the great things about the original Holmes character is he would utilize these things that you didn't have to have, a master's in electrical engineering just as a side, as a side.
That's why he has doctors. That's why, like, if he wanted to know about electrical engineering, he would get an electrical engineer and ask him questions. You know what I mean?
And one of the great things about within, like I said, the historic Christian tradition, the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic tradition, is we utilize what's called the perennial philosophy or classical philosophy, which starts with, historically Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. And what was Socrates' big thing was he was all about, or especially with Aristotle too, but we have these syllogisms, right? And we have deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. And deductive reasoning is when you can start with the things that everybody generally recognizes as true, and then you can move towards a more particular truth. Sure. And where do we see that? One of the, I would say one of the best examples from our Christian tradition is the first way, right? So Aquinas' first way, which he gets from Aristotle, and it's the way towards understanding the existence of God by movement. He starts with the premise, we can see that everything is moving, right? And so sure. we can look at this common kind of phenomenon from our observation. You don't have to have a master's in physics or philosophy to see that everything is moving. And so you can't work that back to infinity. It has to work back to one unmoved mover. And this is where Aquinas and Aristotle would say we would call that unmoved mover God. Now, before somebody on the internet actuallys me, I realize there's a lot more to the argument. Okay, I was giving like a 30-second version of it, but I was just trying to illustrate the point of that's a deductive, right? Starting from a universal or a general and then moving to a specific. And we wouldn't call the existence of God a mystery of faith, but we would call the nature of God a mystery of faith, that it can't be comprehended. We can't know everything, but it can be apprehended. We can know some things.
We've talked a little bit about this, we've swum in these waters all the way back in our apophaticism conversations that we've had like around Batman.
That's back in Batman. That's all the way back in Batman.
The other world's greatest detective.
Do
you think that people's heads are going to explode if we like name drop G.K. Chesterton? We talk about, love and all that stuff. Yeah. And don't actually mention Father Brown.
I know.
Juxtapose Father Brown with Sherlock.
Well, our next segment, which this is a nice segue, is who is the greatest detective? And so this would be a nice way to kind of move into, G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown.
Let's give the audiences what they want, Mike. We'll talk a little bit about Father Brown, because I love Father Brown, actually. For one, did you know that the BBC does also have a Father Brown TV show?
I have seen many, many episodes. Yeah.
Have you? I've seen all of those episodes. I actually really like, I grew up watching Murder, She Wrote. My mom.
Well, and the thing about that Father Brown series is the first couple are based off of G.K. Chesterton's, but then they started making their own. So like not all of those episodes are G.K. Chesterton written stories, but you definitely get the same spirit of the Father Brown character.
He does a good Ron Weasley's dad.
Yeah, exactly.
Job. Yeah.
It was on Netflix I don't think it's on Netflix anymore, but it used to be.
I think that's where I watched it. Yeah, probably on Netflix. But I've seen many of
those, and then I've read a handful of the Father Brown. But anyway,
he's different. He's a little different. I mean, obviously all of these types of short story mysteries or novels, even, they all kind of feel the same to some extent, right? Where like ingenious deduction and like, twist, and I didn't see that detail. That always plays out both in Sherlock and Father Brown. But whereas Sherlock is this crazy, crime solver superhero guy, Father Brown is just a priest, right? And he's just like, I've been in confession so much, like I know what sin is. Like I have a really, really good idea of human nature and like the nature of sin. And so I just like, he always knows, like Sherlock Holmes has his Baker Street irregulars, which are basically just like these like orphans and miscreants and like, slum children that like feed him information. And so that's how he like knows details about like the criminal underworld. Whereas like Father Brown is just like, criminals, I just get their confessions all the time. And so I know all kinds of stuff.
It's like, what world is this where all these people are going to confession? That's where I want to live in that.
Victorian England, I guess. But, people will say that Father Brown is, if Sherlock Holmes is deduction, Father Brown is intuition. It's his like radical empathy, the human condition, and with the people that he's investigating, and his sympathy for them.
He's a Sherlock Holmes of the heart, and that's,
he is, absolutely. I also, frankly, I think that G.K. Chesterton is a more entertaining writer, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Yeah. I mean, like, Conan Doyle is fine. I've read plenty of it. And I like that literature. I like classical literature. And so I'm not knocking him at all. I've read plenty of his stuff. But G.K. Chesterton was just a particularly fun author.
My gosh.
To read.
It's so charming and fun.
He's whimsical. He's like Charles Dickens. Like, I'd put him in the class with like Mark Twain and Charles Dickens as kind of a satirist, and a kind of, he's always winking at the reader. Like, and pretty much every description he gives, everything he says is always kind of like, you can tell he's just like chuckling as he's like typing it out on the typewriter. You know, like he's just a really fun read. And his Father Brown stories are fun.
If anyone's familiar with G.K. Chesterton, which I'd imagine, many people listening to this are like probably know that that's his personality too. Like, just one of the whimsical, I think, is a great word for it.
Also, someone who was big-hearted and open to people and open to learning from people. All of his friends were like the atheists of the day, big Bernard Shaw
somebody who came from a very spiritualist influence background before his conversion to Catholicism too.
Really?
So, and also he wrote a biography of Charles Dickens. So he was very much in, so it does make sense that he would have been any English person would have been familiar with Charles Dickens back then. Sure. But
no, he feels like he's trying to, not trying to, I think he's his own voice, but like there's a kind of whimsomeness to their writing styles.
Guess who else he wrote a biography of, Jacob?
Conan Doyle?
St. Thomas Aquinas.
Oh,
he wrote a biography
and St. Francis.
Aquinas and Francis, but then Charles Dickens too.
I'd be curious to read his Aquinas, because Chesterton says things like Aquinas was smart enough to be silly. Aquinas
here's my endorsement of it. There have obviously been tons of Thomistic scholars, right? Even the fact that it's called the Thomistic school of thought, there's been tons of people who study Aquinas. And one of the Thomistic historians who lived around the same time as G.K. Chesterton was Etienne Gilson, who was a French Thomistic, like I said, writer. And he said,
so much better at saying foreign names than I am. I envy.
That's the but you can say all the names in Dune correctly, so that's
win-win. I mean, it's fair trade, I guess. Sure.
Which is a more marketable skill, Jacob?
Yeah, right.
But he said that he's read a lot on, because a lot of people have done biographies of Thomas Aquinas, and he said that Chesterton's, even despite Chesterton didn't have a doctorate in philosophy or a doctorate in history, or but he said that's the best one that has been made. So there's that endorsement, I think. I mean,
because Chesterton, like to some extent, both Father Brown and Sherlock Holmes, wasn't some kind of crazy expert in all things and big encyclopedia guy. It's just that he had the intuition and the common sense to see the world as it truly is.
He saw the head and the heart of St. Thomas Aquinas, for sure.
That's maybe the most succinct way to put what Sherlock does in stories, is he just sees the world as it truly is, because he's not stuck in some kind of morass. He's just open enough to like just see reality and see it simply, right? These are really kind of profound takeaways.
With the noose.
Kind of, it's like it's not noetic, right? But like, it's a good analogy for noetic, right? Like it's very much like the childlike simplicity of faith, it's a good analogy.
Well, and I think, and you said Sherlock Holmes, but I mean, to the nth degree, Father Brown, especially, right? Like he has that vision of, like you said, human nature or the human condition or fallen humanity. He has that sort of third eye when it comes to seeing people or seeing the heart, which, as you said, it's not an accident. And G.K. Chesterton intuited this too. That's what happens when you hear hundreds and thousands of confessions, is you see the intimacy of the human heart. And, in a sense, Father Brown isn't special, quote unquote, compared to every other priest that's part of his job too. Part of his, I shouldn't say job, part of his ministry.
It occurs to me that there's really kind of just two molds of detective in fiction. Or maybe we could do a third mold where it's like the Sam Spade kind of Dashiell Hammett kind of private detective film noir type. characters too. But we'll do a film noir episode sometime. It'll piggyback off some of these things. But in these more kind of these other two ways, we'll call it two ways of detecting. You got your Sherlock Holmes,
the way of life and the way of death, right? You have
that's kind of. I wish I had a better. I'm not going to go anywhere with that, but no, like so Sherlock Holmes and like Hercule Poirot are like the kind of like uber detailed oriented and kind of snooty, right? Because even Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, he's not humble like at all, right? And that's one thing that's been super consistent across every version of Sherlock Holmes ever.
Yeah,
that he's
I guess
not a
we
humble
get that
man.
really well. We get that.
They do
really
that.
well.
They nail that one good. He is not a humble man. But then the other kind of detective that you see pop up in fiction all the time is the completely humble. So Father Brown is utterly humble, and thus he's able to like overcome his biases and see the truth, right? But then other people like Columbo. This is a deep cut. No one's gonna know who Columbo is anymore. But he was on TV in the 70s, and he used to do TV movies all the time. And I used to watch him with my mom. Murder, She Wrote, and Columbo. But Columbo is one of my favorites, frankly. Columbo's awesome because he's like a Father Brown type person if he was a Los Angeles police detective. So, but he's got this famous shtick where like one thing that's cool
just
about the Columbo
thing, right?
Yeah. But one more thing. I just got one more thing to ask, kind of thing.
Sounds like he's from Brooklyn. Is he from Brooklyn?
I don't know, but he does kind of. It's Peter Falk. Look up Peter Falk. He talks like that. He's Italian. He's probably from Brooklyn. I don't know why he's out in L.A. But I just got one more question for you. All right, maybe not that much Brooklyn. He was
born in New York City, according to his Wikipedia
he's
page.
I'm not doing that far off of an impression of him. It's not a good one, but it is definitely an impression of him. The other cool thing about the Columbo mysteries is that they actually show it's always from the villain's perspective, this is actually kind of unique. You don't really see this very often. It's always the detective trying to figure out what the villain did. In Columbo, everything. The first half hour of any of these shows is you just watching the story of a dude who ends up murdering somebody. And then Columbo gets introduced into it. And then you have to watch Columbo deduce and figure out what you already know as a viewer. And so he's actually kind of like the Jaws shark. Columbo is the antagonist in all of these shows. But he's also like a super humble, awesome antagonist who's cool. But that's what makes him unique and awesome. But yeah, there's always two. There's either the super humble detective or the super prideful detective, which we're going to run out of time. So, but that could.
I don't know. Did you want to? I mean, did you want to talk about Knives Out? Because you've seen both of them, or just the first one?
I haven't seen the second one. I actually. Okay. So my question for you is, what's your favorite detective in pop culture? And I threw a list out there, right? And it's like Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, Columbo, Jessica Fletcher from Murder, She Wrote, Miss Marple, who's basically just Jessica Fletcher. They're like the same character, so they can count as one. And then I just put the Knives Out guy because I don't ever remember what his name was.
I looked it up too because I couldn't remember it, but it's Benoit Blanc, which I was like, okay, see, well, so it's French for blessed white, and I was like,
oh wow.
Yeah, I don't know. Like,
I wonder if there's something there.
Yeah.
I know how much you like your names, Mike. I know how much you like your name symbolism.
Yeah. As you know, well, I'm not going to deny that.
Who's your favorite? Who's your favorite detective in fiction?
I mean, of course, it's got to be Father Brown. Like, I'm
going to go Columbo.
I love Father Brown.
I'm going to go Columbo because he's kind of like a cooler Father Brown, and I'm not Catholic, so I don't have to just like choose the Catholic.
Yeah, just toe the party line that the No, I mean
I'm free. I'm free to choose other things.
After you literally spent just like 10 straight minutes like just fawning over how great of a character he is, and then you're just going to take a total left turn and
that's the twist. Sure, you can't have this episode without there being a twist ending, Mike.
But sure, I'm the simp. But you know, we probably both talked about Father Brown about the same. Oh my gosh, what was I going to say? Nancy Drew. You forgot to include Nancy Drew.
I don't have Nancy Drew, the Hardy Boys in there. Yeah, I read those novels when I was a kid. They're fun.
I maybe did like 2 or 3 Hardy Boys ones.
Boxcar Children.
Was that a mystery? I mean, I remember them, but they weren't mysteries, were they?
I don't know. It's been a long time since I read Boxcar Children. But that's in that same vein. All right.
No, it's definitely fun for all the great reasons you've already explained. Yeah. Plus, you're going to turn your back on Chesterton too. See, you're just a turncoat, is what you are, Jacob.
I'm a simp for Hollywood of the 1970s. So,
yeah, takes you back.
Play us out.
That's just it's
Mike.
just so far before my time. What do you mean? You want me to like do music or something? What is that? Like the game is on. You want me to say the game is on? Is that going to be
It's elementary, my dear Mikhail, whatever your real name is.
Okay, Mike is fine. Yeah.
It's elementary.
Thanks, guys, thanks for joining this. Really fun conversation, Jake. Thanks for joining us for this conversation of the Voyage podcast, and just want to encourage you guys to like and subscribe, leave a 5-star rating, positive comment, or positive review for the show, and gets us out there to more people so that we can listen to I don't know, Jacob go back and forth, hem and haw on his different favorite characters and stuff. Maybe if you guys are really lucky, you'll get to hear what he thinks about the new Disney movie.
Oh man, we started.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.